Welcome back. We saw each other last in November. December we should have done, you're not listening, Mein Kampf, which for many reasons was cancelled. I was sorry to do it, but I felt it was just necessary to do it. It would just have been too contentious. However, we are doing a version of Mein Kampf tonight, I suppose, because you can see just how it dovetails. So there was some thinking on my part in conceptualizing this course, and so understanding today, in talking about Feuchtwanger, it actually gives us the cultural matrix out of which Mein Kampf grew. And the two works, actually one historical and one fictional, do correspond to each other in some way. And in the middle, of course, I had Gottfried Keller just as a reorientation to what was it to be a bourgeois in the 19th century and to have liberal ideas. What is the matrix that was there, cultural matrix of goodness and political democracy, and even in Switzerland, where democracy is sort of a little bit on the iffy side and was always tempered, I would say, by Turkish elements and by rootedness and by Heimatgefühl and all those things. But on the other hand, there was a very strong democratic tradition also, and a tradition of independence, and this is something that Gottfried Keller stood for, and that went away or was negated by the developments that we seem to have area. So the three works, although they are very different, Mein Kampf and the Grüne Heimat, and today do correspond to each other. So I wanted to start today. You can see what it does when the Consul General puts his weight behind it. Tomorrow's event, I hope you did register, is sold out, is booked. You can no longer get in. I'll say the same thing I'm saying tonight, but tomorrow I'll be saying it to the masses, and today I'll be saying it to the elite. So if you come tomorrow,
looks like more people are coming tomorrow.
Tomorrow, we already reached fire code. I mean, it has nothing to do with me, of course. It's all due to the sharks and to the film. So tomorrow there will be this movie, which is actually tonight being shown at the Boston Public Library for the Hoi Polloi. Tomorrow it will be shown under the auspices of the German Consul General about the couple, Martha and Wasil Sharp, who were Unitarians from Wellesley, and who made themselves very strong and saved Feuchtwanger's life. They were the ones who connected to Marion Fry and learned about Feuchtwanger's internment in the Camp des Milles. And Martha got him out, his wife got him out, but they made sure that he was conducted safely to the French-Spanish border in the summer of 1940, and they put him on a train, and they went on the train with him all the way through Spain and arrived in Lisbon and put him on a boat. In fact, Martha Wasil gave him his ticket. She had a berth, and he could get that berth, and he went on the Excalibur. That was his ship, and he arrived on October 2nd, 1940, in New York. If you think about this was not a matter of course. You obviously know about the fate of Walter Benjamin, who in September killed himself exactly stuck on that border, the French-Spanish border, and actually a little bit before Karl Einstein, who was an expressionist art critic and writer, very, very famous at the time, also got stuck on that same border, and he jumped from a bridge because he didn't want to be caught by the Gestapo. So it was not a matter of course, and there were many, there were thousands of refugees, and there were hundreds of artists, well-known artists, famous artists, who got stuck. So Feuchtwanger was extraordinarily lucky to have escaped. And in part, he was saved because he was famous at the time, and he was made famous by this novel, not just by this novel, but also by Ulysses, which he had just written a few years earlier, in 1925. Let me just tell you a little bit about Feuchtwanger. As you know, he was born in 1884 in Munich. That makes him 9 years younger than Thomas Mann. He came from a family that had very, very long roots in Bavaria. The family traces its descent to the 1500s, to the 16th century, lived in Fürth, and later moved to Munich. His great-grandfather had 18 children. His grandfather had 7 children. He was one. His father was actually born in 1854, and the grandfather was called Seligman, and his great-grandfather and the grandfather was called Eltern, but his father was called Sigmund. So you can see in 1854, so you have a family of very, very long roots in Bavaria, Jewishly observant, in fact Orthodox, which drove Feuchtwanger crazy. In fact, there is a passage that he wrote in his memoirs. I'm going to read it in German. To conflict with the family. Let me actually finish the other thought first. Sigmund, you can see there's the transition from Elkan to Sigmund tells you something about the assimilation of Jews into Germany, which becomes, of course, a theme in Erfolg. Sigmund was born in 1854. Wagner writes, Stuart among you, Sigmund and Sieglinde, composed by Wagner in 1854, which became, of course, part 2 of the Rheingold Walküre. And it was exactly the time also when German Jews became extraordinarily successful. So Leon writes, meine Eltern hielten darauf, dass ich die umständlichen, mühevollen Riten rabbinischen Judentums, die auf Schritt und Tritt ins tägliche Leben eingreifen, minutiös befolgen. And so it goes on. So his father insisted that he would observe the difficult and beschwerlich, mühevoll, how do you call that, mühevoll? Takes a lot of effort. A lot of effort demanding rites of rabbinic Judaism, that he had to observe all of Kashrut, that he had to observe all of Shabbat. And not only that, he was also forced to have once a week, together with his other brothers, instruction in Hebrew and Aramaic. So he was taught the Talmud. Interestingly enough, unlike many of his peers, he never complains about the father. There's nowhere in his work any issues like we have them with Unterm Rad, with Hermann Hesse, or we have it with Musil. There's no complaints anywhere. He's very discreet about that, and very generous, in fact, toward his father. He's never complains about the strictness of his upbringing, even though there were major conflicts. He actually takes off. He goes to gymnasium, as many of course do. Graduates in 1903, goes to Munich, which was center of the Bohème, to Schwabing, where George lives there at this time. Many other of the Bohemians live there. He studies history and German literature at the University of Munich, and is very fortunate to graduate with a PhD 4 years later. I don't know how one does a PhD in 4 years, but he did, and he wrote his PhD on Hein and the Rabbi Bacher. In fact, he is Detlef, and he has come back from the Villa Aurora in Pacific Palisades, which was the home of Feuchtwanger. And I hope you will, in 1 minute, when I'm going to California, you will talk a little bit about that. Okay, so how did he get to California? Not so fast. So in 1907, he finishes his PhD, and he is now completely absorbed in the Bohemian circle in Schwabing. And he begins writing plays, and he's actually fairly successful as a playwright. He has many, many affairs. I don't think he's particularly attractive, but women thought he was very attractive. And he has a lover who's very similar to Johanna Klein, Martha. And now comes the little Bohemian, the bourgeois comes out from underneath the Bohemian mask. When she gets pregnant in 1912, he immediately says, okay, let's marry. She doesn't want to do it, but he insists. And they go to Überlingen, which is where Walser lives now, and she marries him in a black long dress with a black hat, and she's already hugely pregnant. And they go to Überlingen, which is like about 2.5 hours from Munich, because they just thought it was kind of very neat to get married in like some provincial thing, and you could do it like me going to your own funeral, which may or may not have been what she was thinking. It was actually a very bad omen, because the little girl she gives birth to dies. And there were no more children, so they actually had no children. They go to Lausanne, she gives birth in Lausanne, and from Lausanne they're going to travel around a little bit, and they end up on a grand tour through northern Africa. I was smart. A lot of the expressionist writers went to Tunisia and were painting there, and of course they are caught by surprise there by the First World War. And the French, of course, is an announcement of the future when they turn them right away, but insist they have to return to Munich, and they return to Munich. And Leon is drafted into the army. That's very hard to imagine, but he's drafted into the army. And for 5 months he drills as a private. He did not use his privilege, he did not use the money to buy himself free, and unfortunately collapses because he's bleeding from the stomach, which is in fact a preview of his would-be dying of stomach cancer, of course, a few decades later. So he is now released from the army. He is still part of the army, but he's unfit for service. And active man as he is, says, now I really have to use my time well, and I got to do something. And the best thing that one could do if one was an artist is one was writing plays. And in fact, in the 4 years of the war, 1914 to 1918, he writes 9 plays. And they are performed all over Germany. In fact, one scholar has counted that there are between 1915, which is in fact where the first play was performed, to 1932, there were 5,000 performances all over Germany of Leon Feuchtwanger's plays. I remember that there was a play actually that's written much later, in 1927, called the Petroleuminsel. Maybe some of you know it. It was very famous in Germany even in the 70s and 80s, and I remember being extra in there and not understanding at all what this play was about. But he was famous at the time, probably the most widely performed playwright of all. In 1919, this all changes because he meets Bertolt Brecht. Bertolt Brecht moves from Augsburg to Munich just after the war in 1919, and they become extraordinary friends. They're very different. Feuchtwanger is an individualist. Brecht is, his gruff old self. In fact, Caspar Pöckel in Der Erfolg is a portrait of Brecht, and you could see just how very different those characters are, but they sort of need each other. And one of the things that is extraordinary about Feuchtwanger is he's not a jealous person. He's not envious. He recognizes immediately how extraordinary Brecht is as a playwright. And when Brecht gives him Trommeln in der Nacht, one of his drums at night, his play, he sends it to Otto Falkenberg, who was the director of the Kammerspiele in München, one of the most important theaters at the time. He's a competitor, but he sends this play there, and of course Brecht gets hired, and from there goes on to Berlin and to great fame. Interesting enough is the moment that he becomes friends with Brecht and recognizes just what it takes now to be effective as a playwright. His own plays are fine, they're sort of conventional and very witty, but they're very effective plays, but they're not politically gripping. They don't have the pizzazz, they don't have the innovation or the genius that you can see in Brecht. He stops writing plays. And he takes one of the plays that he's been sort of pulling back a little bit, although it's been performed very successfully, called Jud Süß, and he makes it into a novel. And the novel is about this courtier in 18th century Baden-Württemberg, or actually Württemberg at the time, who rises to great power, and in the end is actually hoisted by his own petard and is cruelly tortured to death after a kind of show trial. And the life model for that play was actually Walter Rathenau, who was very conflicted about his being Jewish, very conflicted about accepting power, but did it ultimately, and of course was killed. In fact, right during the time that Feuchtwanger was writing this novel, he started writing the novel Jud Süß in early 1921, and he finished it in September 1922, and Rathenau was shot on June 24th, 1922. So there's something about Feuchtwanger being always on time, being always right there and commenting on political events as they were actually unfolding, but in historical garb. So the novel was finished in 1922, and he could not find a publisher. It took him 3 years to find a publisher. He was right away writing a second historical novel, Die Hessische Herzogin Margarete Maltasch, the ugly Duchess. Margarete Maltasch, also about a historical figure, about a duchess who was extraordinarily ugly, a metaphor for Jews, and try to deal with that. How can you hide or come to terms with something that is staring other people in the face and you can do nothing about it, because that is just who you are. So this is what the second novel is about. He wrote that between 1922 and 1923. And he managed to publish that one, so it was a small book, came out in some small Berlin publisher in 1923. And then he was very lucky. He has a lucky break because during that time, Americans are still very educated and they know languages. And the publisher of, well, that's a little different now. The publisher of Viking Press, the chief executive officer there, you could say, so the chief lector, the chief editor-in-chief, I would say, of Viking Press, which was a very significant press at the time, was vacationing in Sweden in the summer of 1925, and someone gave him this novel, Jutsus, which had appeared in Drei Masken Verlag, a very small publisher, with just about 6,000 copies, and he read it, so which means he must have read German. Ben Hübschen said, this is stunning, this is extraordinary, I'm understanding Germany all of a sudden. This explains to me what is going on right now. He sent a telegram to Feuchtwanger, and he said, I want the English rights, and he got the English rights. And the novel was published in October 1926 in New York, and in November 1926 in London by Martin Secker, also an extraordinary publisher, and it was a stunning success. English readers in America and in Great Britain for the first time understood what it was like to be Jewish in Germany, even though this was a historical novel. So he became extraordinarily well known in England and in America, and that affected the sales of his novels in Germany. So within a very short time now, he sells about 100,000 copies of Jutsus in German. Actually, it took a little while to about 1930, but within 5 years. That was, if you're looking at inflation, okay, people did not spend money on books during that time in the mid-1920s. That was an extraordinary success. I mean, you're sure they did spend money, but 100,000 copies, that is quite a number. So he was wealthy. He was already wealthy because, in fact, I forgot to tell you, his grandfather, I think, founded a margarine factory on the outskirts of Munich, and his father ran this margarine factory, which is why the left-wing avant-garde called Feuchtwanger das Margarinebarönchen, so the little baron of margarine. So there's all this teasing of Feuchtwanger going on all the time, because he was bourgeois, pretended not to be bourgeois, but he was, and you could tell he was coming from money, which has something to do with his not, being jealous, his not being envious. There was a naturalness for him. There was grace with him to let other people, have their opinion, and he was himself, and other people were other people, and he was very supportive of younger talents, as you could see in the case of Brecht. Okay, so now he was famous, and he was rolling, and things got very, very ugly in Munich, as you now know from reading this book, and he decided that he was going to Berlin also, because Brecht had left for Berlin. He didn't have a sparring partner anymore, and Munich was very difficult to live with. So this man whose ancestors go all the way back to the 16th century, and whose father spoke Bavarian. In fact, fortunately, he had a little bit of a lilt, but he wasn't really speaking super extra Bavarian. So he moved to Berlin, and he withdrew. He wrote a couple more plays, but he withdrew really from the theater, and he started to focus on novels. And in 1927, he begins writing a book that we'll be talking about, and it takes him to about 1930 to finish it. And why he's writing it is revealed in the book in the last chapter. Probably not many of you actually got there, so I will be talking about that. So because it is a 780-page whopper. And it was published by now a well-known publisher, Kiepenheuer and Witsch. Actually, Kiepenheuer only at the time, Gustav Kiepenheuer, in two volumes, looking very sturdy and bourgeois and self-important, in black binding. Bring the first editions tomorrow. I'm sorry, I left without bringing the first editions. It became, that too, became a success. Especially, it was translated right away into English, actually by the translators of Kafka's works, Villa and Namur. And it was extraordinary. It seemed to explain, and this is really why the Sharps got so engaged in rescuing him, because it explained what was going on in Bavaria to an English-speaking audience, better perhaps than the newspapers, because it was made clear what were the cultural components that enabled the rise of fascism. So he was really seen not so much as a historical novelist, but as a political novelist. Of course, he was now famous. He was out, just like, in fact, Thomas Mann. He was off in 1932 to give talks I think it was in America at the time. Yeah, in America. I was thinking if it was in England. He was in America at the time when he learned, of course, of Hitler's rise to power, and he did not return. And went into exile. In fact, was looking around for a little bit for a place for a while, and then settled in Saint-Marie-sur-Mer, in the south of France, and near Nizza, near Bandol, but a little bit more to the west, and in a small place which became very soon a center for the exiles, and was sitting there. And then, of course, the Germans also captured France, and Vichy France made sure that the Jews were hunted down. And he was interned, and then of course there was a famous rescue, and because actually his wife was also interned in Gurs, where the Jews of Baden, they were all caught, and one day all the Jews in Baden had to report to the train station, and like sheep to slaughter. Of course the Jews show up at the train station and get deported to Gurs, and Martha Feuchtwanger ended up in that women's camp in Gurs. There was one in Gurs and one in Riefsalt. And it was filled with German Jews, and she was a spunky lady. She escaped, and she brought women's clothes to Feuchtwanger, so that he's a very feminine face in a certain way, can look like an old babushka. You put something on, and he looks like an old lady. And so he escaped in women's clothes, and then they were hiding in Marseille, and from there they were connected to the underground with the shops, and he was brought to rescue. When he was in New York, of course, he was looking for a place to be, and I saw the pictures. Detlef sent me a picture this morning. I don't know how you made it from Los Angeles to be here. Wasn't that this morning you sent me a picture? From Villa Aurora. It is absolutely magnificent. It's a villa. Come and talk to us a little bit about that. It's a villa in a Spanish style, and now looks beige. Seems to have a magnificent garden and a view of the Pacific.
It's 1 mile from the Pacific.
Come up here and talk.
I can speak from here.
We can hear you better. We can't hear you.
When they bought it, they spent $9,000.
$9,000? But that was a lot of money back then. That was a lot.
And they furnished it with second-hand furniture. So it was not so bourgeois at the beginning. So they built up their life slowly. But everything, after he died, she still lived 30 years in that building.
Yeah, but after he died, I think it was very difficult for her money-wise, and she negotiated with the University of Southern California that she would get the Wohnrecht of Lebenszeit, so the right to live there, in exchange for the upkeep of the house, and then I think it went to the University of California. Now it's an International Studies Center, no?
It was bought by the State Department.
Oh, now it was?
The State Department.
Yeah, but that was years later, no?
And they renovated it.
Yeah.
And in '95 they turned it into a villa for artists in residence. So now every year there are 4 artists in residence of literature, film, music, and visual arts.
What was with all these pictures? But you said there's Heiner Müller's typewriter is there? How did that
The very
work?
first artist in residence was Heiner Müller. At the time he got a scholarship from the Goethe Foundation,
Wow.
which is just around the corner.
Wow.
And he didn't like their apartments.
Wow.
They were still building, and he said, "No, I want to move in that villa." And he moved into this
I would
villa
too.
And left his typing machine there.
Wow, it's wonderful.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place.
I mean, it is an exquisite place. And in one of the biographies that I read, there's actually a very good one, Wilhelm von Sternburg, 1994. It's actually really the first book that appreciates Feuchtwanger as a first-rate writer. Tomorrow I'm going to talk a little bit about the disappreciation and non-appreciation of Feuchtwanger and how that actually changed. And it's really only in the 1990s that we have an appreciation of Feuchtwanger as a first-rate writer. There are still some people who grumble, who think that he's a second-rate writer. I think if Clive was here, he would say, but there are greater writers than that. But it is because he keeps us on the straight and narrow aesthetically, and I think that it is a challenge, and I would have loved to spar with him on that one. But maybe one of you will make the aesthetic argument against Feuchtwanger, because it is an argument that one needs to consider. But there are other ways to think about art. Now, at the point of being about art, my claim, of course, is today, and it's very difficult to get a grip on that novel, is that this is a novel about the effectiveness of art. So that is actually all I have to say about this, and I'm going to prove it with 3 examples. I had a professor who said, You know that you're in the presence of an academic when he or she proposes the most perverse point of view and proves it with 3 examples. So this is what I will do now. Now, you've heard my spiel. This is our preparation. Let me ask you, before I segue into unfolding this novel, how did you do on the reading? What was your impression? How far did you get? Has anyone in this room actually finished it? Whoa! Yes! 2 acclamations. Chapeau. That is fabulous. Okay, has anyone, at what point did you guys give up, and why did you give up?
When I couldn't get the book.
Oh no!
I couldn't.
Why didn't you go on?
Well, you
It
need
cannot
don't
be,
you?
but it's on
You need
Amazon.
it. Yeah,
she read
I read
Oppenheimer,
this
I
one, and it's only later that I realized you wanted the other book. I concentrated on this one.
Ah, of course.
And so, well, anyway.
You guys did
neither
you read because I left out Geschwister Oppenheim, which was really called Oppenheim. No,
Well, it
excuse
used to be
me.
Oppenheim.
I have a first edition. It says Geschwister Oppenheim.
That's right.
Okay,
That's
first
right.
edition, very rare. Came out with Querido in 1933 in Amsterdam, and there was a famous Nazi by the name of Oppenheim, and he said, "You cannot publish this novel. Okay, it's got to be changed to Oppenheim," and he changed it to Oppenheim. Okay, so this is why some people have Oppenheim and some people have Oppenheim. Okay, so Oppenheim is what we have now. Yes, I announced it first. I found it too depressing. And in fact, I always announce both of them. It is more important to come to terms with the preparatory novel. This is the Wartesaal trilogy. So there are 3 books. I forget actually what's the last? Exil. Okay, so we have Erfolg, Geschwister Oppermann, or Oppenheim. And we have Exil, and the 3 form the so-called Wartesaal trilogy, which is really a chronicle of the Nazis' rise to power all the way to about 1939, outbreak of the war, actually to the exiles. Okay, so my apologies. So I'm sorry. So you're right. You should want to be about the ascending argument.
And then I'm looking at the Minutemen, to find the book. And it had 1 copy in Medford, and it said lost. And that's all. There was no copy.
I buy copies on Amazon. Okay, so all right, one argument. Yes.
Anyway.
No, I just tried to get it from Boston University, and they even tried to recall it, get somebody to bring
I'm
back.
not the one
Whoever has it. I'm sure it's somebody here.
I didn't even take the Widenet library copy.
So,
for somebody else.
several weeks I've been trying to get it.
Right, okay. So how far did you get, and what's your impression? How did you deal with the novel? Because I need to understand where we are in order to be able to see what I will do with it. Because I cannot really play with the novel or unfold it by just telling you what the content is. It is absolutely confusing. It would be like telling you the content of Men Without Qualities. Okay, if you think about it, during that time, so we're looking at the time 1927 to 1930 when he was writing. Think about the books that were written during that time. They are all doorstops. They're telephone books. Berlin Alexanderplatz. It doesn't really have a plot. Okay, 1924, The Magic Mountain is a little bit earlier. Robert Musil, the first volume of Mann ohne Eigenschaften. Finished, in fact, during that time, 1927, is À la recherche du temps perdu, another multi-volume book. A little bit before that, of course, we have Ulysses. So we're getting massive books that are trying to be of analyses of the time, even though it's in historical regard, of course, for Ulysses. Tell me about your reading experience since you finished the book, and then Antosh, of course.
Well, I have to say, the last 50 pages was pretty fast.
You're like me. I was sitting there literally making time. I mean, you of course, I read it actually in her house. I had to go into exile. Said if I have to read it, I had 400 pages left, and I knew I really had to finish it. And I said, on this weekend, I'm doing it. I was sitting there hour after hour just reading it because, it is hard. It is hard. What's hard about it?
Well, it was, for me, easy in fact, because I read them from a historical point of view more than a literary point of view.
Sure.
So, from a historical point of view, it's absolutely fascinating and sort of delightful to read.
It was, yeah.
And
You found it depressing, though, right?
Oh, you felt the doom was coming, but you didn't. Well, because you knew what happened, and he
But
did.
because you are reading it. In fact, imagine, of course, one of the thrilling things we, of course, recognize just how good the portrait of Hitler is in that. Robert Kutzner as Hitler is extraordinary how he is captured in the way he practices with Konrad Stolzing before the mirror. And in fact, in the later passages, when Hitler gives a talk, it is observed from the perspective of this actor instructor, this old actor from the Hoftheater, whom he, Feuchtwanger says, Hitler has hired to instruct him how to deliver a speech. And the actor always says, oh, and this is how I was giving Hamlet, and this is how I was giving Don Carlos, and this is how I was giving Fiesco and Genua, this is how I was giving all these famous figures. I can recognize that in Hitler. This is an extraordinary analysis of in 1930, of someone who was really performing. Okay, rhetoric as performance. I claimed that this was about art. You will see this entire novel consists of people who are artists. Okay, you read it from a historical point of view, and it is stunning. Stunning. Could not be known in 1930 just how central to Hitler's policies the rhetoric became. Also, of course, of Goethe. So that's one bit. Anyone else want to make a macro comment on?
Well,
Yes.
that was in the Eva Braun biography about him.
Yes,
realizing
yes, the instruction, yes, that he hired a speech instructor, but an actor to instruct him on how to deliver, how to stand, how to project, what to do with the hands. Yes, absolutely. No, that is based on truth.
Yeah, I didn't see this part, but I wonder if he watched silent movies because they're melodramatic at that time in the late 20s. But he did practice in front of the mirrors. He did believe rhetoric was more important than the written word. And he practiced for 4 or 5 years in Munich before he was ready to go out and get up on the big stage.
Talkies came in 1922. Yes, was that the first? The switch from silent movies to talkies to talking movies. 1925. 29. So it's late. It's late. So on movies before that, we are just with music, with pianists. So 1929, so that's late.
But another big influence on him earlier on, and this has also been studied in Chum, is from his earlier years in Vienna. He was watching the Emperor, and especially the Jubilee.
Luega. If you remember, I'm loath to cite it, but I will. The first chapters of Mein Kampf, he talks about what he learned from the SPD, from the Social Democrats, and he said, what I learned from them was demagoguery. I learned from them as I was observing them giving speeches, how to direct the masses, what to do with the crowd, how to manipulate the crowd. And he was praising the Social Democrats for the rhetorical instruction that he got. That is, I think, chapter 2 in Mein Kampf. Sorry to point at you, I didn't mean to do that, actually.
Luega is the one that's mentioned.
Luega is the one who, of course...
He also went to the book theater. He had very little money, but he went to the book theater, nevertheless, to watch.
For sure.
Yeah.
So Luega, the mayor, the anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna, elected I think in 1895, was a great rhetorical instructor. Okay. So having said that, now what are we going to do with the novel? How are we going to do that? How are we going to handle that? Okay. Let me ask you, those of you who read it, what is the novel about? In fact, I left my beautiful. Is that I'm talking German to you. Is this a roll of paper? Oh, no. Can you go to my car and get this reminded? Okay, I'll do it without it. Because I told you that in order to keep track of the novel, you had to make a diagram. of the people. Did you guys do it? No. Okay, so then we will do it together. Okay, what is the novel about? How can we handle it? What are ways, how could you, when you have this, you have 780 pages of historical analysis, you have a huge array of people, it's almost like reading Tolstoy. What do you do? How do you open that? What is your aim? When did it click for you that you had to read this novel not as a historical novel? Was there any point that you said, okay, what's this guy after? And this can go on for 1,200 pages, 1,500 pages. When is it going to stop? Is there, and now we're back to the aesthetic question, and I missed 5. Is there an aesthetic structure that is underlying all of this, or is it just an amorphous mass? What do we do?
Well, let me take the easy way out.
Yeah,
first.
good.
I'm not sure about the aesthetic structure. I may be more at loss than anyone else, but I really did not know how to use that approach.
Yeah.
But when it comes to cultural and historic analysis,
Yeah.
I found the book to be almost irresistible.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I only had 5 days to read it, and I also had difficulty getting a copy. And I managed to read the end of part 3.
That's very good.
So
That's good.
473.
That's good. So we're halfway.
What I think stood out most was a minute, very realistic, and at the same time critical, and sometimes even kind of nasty, with little steps here and there. Analysis of the variations, I mean dozens and dozens of variations of this society, which is, to put it very, very strongly, not quite rotten to the core, but it comes close to that. And as you follow the various alliances, competitive entities, shifting relationships, and you add to politics and power, the power games, the sexual element, then you have a very powerful mixture, which Deutschlander really knows how to detail and clearly enough so that you can actually keep track of dozens of personalities.
That's good. Let me push you a little bit further. What motivates people in that book? Because it's really actually only one principle. Power, okay? But Cajetan Lechner doesn't have power. Can you, what you need to go even beyond power? Of course, Jud Süß was called power. In the English translation of Jud Süß was called power. Feuchtwanger is always interested in power. How do people get power? How do people get power? This is what the book is about. The book is about how do you get power, and when you have power, how do you stay in that? And that's where your perspective comes in, because you could read the book. Why is that?
Because these people know how to play a game.
Okay, now you have to say that you grew up in Soviet Union. Okay, we're faithmonger, they're called faithmonger. We actually didn't know we were talking about the same guy. I said, I'm reading this Feuchtwanger, do you want to read an English copy? And I gave her the English copy. I see it first edition, English copy, success. And she started reading this, and she said, I can't read this. What is this? This looks familiar. I said, oh, you're talking about faithmonger. And she went online, and there was the Russian text. Okay, and then something extraordinary happens, and that goes to show how reading literature is culturally conditioned. Eugenia started reading this in Russian, and she said, I can't read this. This is absolutely oppressive to me. And the reason is that the system that we are being shown here of total opportunism, of using people in order to get ahead by hook or crook, was precisely what has not been eradicated since the Tsarist regime. In fact, has blossomed in the Soviet regime and into the post-Soviet period. And so you had to put it down, because what you could describe as a closing in and then as an oppressiveness for you, who has lived through it, was very immediate. For us, For someone like me, who's grown up in the Federal Republic, to me this is very distant. This is not immediate. Herr Hirschhorn, did you read the book? What is your, because you have lived through this, what was your experience, your reading experience with that?
I'm pretty lost, but I will.
You're lost?
Yes, I will try desperately to tell you something that makes sense. I thought that what surprised me right at the beginning is how much art was used versus what looked like naked power.
Good.
That some of the people in the picture there were using something else was trying to use the art. It surprised me that the character who went to jail because of someone could send them to jail because he had a different view of art. So that's about as much as I can tell you that makes sense.
We got art, we got power, we got politics. It's all thrown into this mix. Okay, the book is about how do you get power and how do you maintain power and what are the games you need to play in order to stay in power. And it is played in, as you say, in many, many variations. And art is part of that. Okay, and we're going to have to find out how that is. Elena, do you want to make a bit and then we start
just
going
one bit. I was struck by the local flavor.
Flavor.
Knowing Munich, and Munich gives you goosebumps. Depends on how you walk through Munich, and I just can see it. Also, having stepped into the Hofbräuhaus and kind of smelling.
Are you from Munich?
No. I'm not.
Would you like to be from Munich?
No, I would not. I'm from different places. But I went to school in Hamburg, by the way, and so this is a different perspective altogether. But Munich, this whole smell of Munich, I think is here.
Yeah.
And
the smell of Munich, the smell of the beer and the pretzel and the beer, the Hofbräuhaus.
And it's attractive in one way and it's repulsive in another way. And I find this just very lively.
Okay, so it makes the argument that is actually underlying this entire course, because we are talking about the literary culture of Munich from 1850 to 1950. And my argument was that there was something specific about the culture of Bavaria that made it possible for Hitler to come to power then. This book is a case in point, is proving a sort of is actually my major argument. Let's go look really at what is going on. So at the center of this book is who? This is actually already to ask a provocative question, but if people who read page up to page 25 can answer that. I'm just made that up. Maybe somebody will, you know. Okay, the pretend, person at the center of this book is a man by the name of Krüger. Martin Krüger. Okay? Who is this Martin Krüger?
Deputy Minister of Fine Arts.
He's a what?
Deputy Minister of Fine Arts.
Deputy Minister of Fine Arts. He is the assistant to the director who runs the National Gallery. Okay, what's his crime?
Exposed to pictures.
What?
Get pictures.
Doesn't he have an exhibit of modern art?
Yeah. Can you be more specific?
To get to picture that doesn't fit in.
Okay, which pictures? Okay. So he has an exhibit. Okay, he has an exhibit of 3 pictures. So those pictures are very important. Okay, what are the 3 pictures? Because they are symbolic. Let me make before we go to this. Okay, I'm just making the J to remind myself of where I'm stuck. Okay, let me make an argument when it clicked for me, because I asked you this question, it was unfair of me not to answer it, that this novel ought not to be read realistically, but structurally. That the argument, the power of the argument, is in the structure of the society that it exposes, clicked for me at one point, when I was looking at Gaia. Siegbert Gaia. Gaia means vulture. Okay, Siegbert Gaia, who is the defense attorney for Krüger. Siegbert Gaia is a Jew, and he falls in love only one time. Are you following me on Gaia? Are you agreeing with me on Gaia? Because I thought that you would be making this argument.
I read the Altamans.
I am so sorry. Okay, so there's a Siegfried Gaia. There's one pronounced Jew in this novel. Yeah, the Jewish context is very thin, but after I will be looking at you in order for you to either argue against me or with me. He's a Jewish guy, and in fact he's called the Sauyud by Klenk very early on. The Sauyud. Okay, we don't want any change, we don't want nothing, nobody wants to learn anything, nobody wants to improve. What is this Sauyud doing there? What is this pig Jew doing there? We don't want to be improved. We want to vary exactly like it is. Okay, this is Otto Klenk, very early, maybe chapter 3. And this Gaia falls in love one time with someone from northern Germany, Ellis Bornkamp, or Bornhag, or whatever her name is, Bornhag. Okay, and it is on a beautiful lake, and she conceives, and she has this son Ellis. And even though Gaia wants to marry her and is begging to marry her, she doesn't. She turns very nasty, and she leaves him, and she takes this son, and she goes to northern Germany and raises this son with absolute disdain for his father. Throughout this novel, this Erich Bornkamp pops up time and again, and he becomes an aesthete, he becomes a nihilist, he becomes attracted to the homosexual, aesthetic, nihilistic side of the Nazi party, which also attracted this sort of French. And he has utter contempt for his father, but will come to his father's office to ask for money. And the father is absolutely abject, will not allows himself, because he was in love with this person who responded with hatred to him, will give the son money, even when it is clear that the son has participated in a very ugly murder of a servant girl. And he writes to his father, who is meanwhile a deputy in the Reichstag, a delegate to the Reichstag. He will send money to the son so that the son could go could go abroad if caught, and the son dies at the Hitlerputsch on Feldherrnhalle. Okay, what clicked for me was that this needs to be read as a metaphor of the Jewish relationship to the Germans, of which Feuchtwanger was extremely critical. I'm wondering if you could see it that way. That the Jews were falling for the Germans and their culture, but that the love was not requited, and that they were going for the Germans, for German culture, even to the degree of completely selling out, and that is portrayed in the figure of Gaia, who is not realistic, whose actions vis-à-vis Erich cannot be believed because they are psychologically so cruel, and that it needs to be read as precisely what Gershom Scholem described as an unrequited love affair of the Jews for the Germans, and that Feuchtwanger, who stood up for himself being Jewish, was very critical of this attitude, and it is in fact, you could say, a sharpening of what he saw as the central conflict of Walter Rathenau, and in fact a conflict that he had treated in Lud Süß. And that relationship between Erich and Gaia made clear to me that one had to look in a certain way at this book as a grand metaphor of the political structure of Bavaria that made it possible for a quicker derisive power. So that was my into thinking that I needed to look at the book structurally. Okay, and then I think I can do it now. Yes.
There's a book by Feuchtwanger which is mostly lost. This is the Jewess of Toledo.
The Judith von Toledo, the last book. The last book.
This is exactly the same. This is exactly the same topic. It's rolled into a different story. He transplants it to 12th century Spain, where Rachel falls in love with Alfonso and so on. And this is exactly the same situation because she in the end dies. And this is she's going to this is not ending well. And this is this falling in love, this infatuation that she feels, and I think this is exactly the same variation on this theme that we have.
So it makes perfect sense because he conceived the two last historical novels as bookends the end of his life, to the first two historical novels that he wrote. And if you're looking at the Walter Rathenau Ulysses scene, it pops up at the end, and it is crystallized, sharpened, almost to the degree of being unbearable, because Gaia is at the end destroyed. Once he learns that his son was killed at Feldherrnhalle during the Hitler Putsch, he falls completely apart, because now there is the object of his love is gone, and he goes to southern France, and he sits Shiva for his son. He has all the rights of Shiva, even though halakhically he's not allowed to sit Shiva for a son, because the son was not Jewish. But he goes back, withdraws into his Jewishness, because he understands at this point that this love for the Germans and their culture can never be, is never going to be fulfilled. So he dies of this unfulfilled love. So if you read this as a metaphor, as a sharpening of the issue raised by Rathenau, you understand that what he was doing, even though it looks like a realistic portrait, might not be one. So then I was thinking, okay, so maybe there are other ways of looking at this, and I'm going to go now back to this Krüger. So this Krüger is nabbed by the powers that be because he has exhibited 3 paintings that are not acceptable. Because, well, we'll have to see. So the first one is Joseph and his brothers. The second picture is
self-portrait of the little.
Okay, an act, a female act, female. So she's a topless nude, self-portrait. And the third?
Isn't it Jesus?
Is the crucifixus, is called crucifixus. Okay, good. In order to understand why Krüger gets nabbed, we need to understand what's offensive about the pictures. And it's the same thing in all 3. Okay, you now need to go to chapter 1, where Joseph and his brothers is described. Or you can, if you remember from the Crucifixus, do you remember this is by Greiderer? So this is by this guy Greiderer, and this is by this lady Heide, and this is by the crazy guy Landholzer, who was later visited by Potte. What is offensive about these pictures? Let's start with the Crucifixus. This was actually a real case, okay? In the Crucifixus, Christ is shown as suffering. He's not shown as Christ. When the pictures describe the physicality of the suffering Jesus on the cross is almost obscene. It is upsetting people because it shows the reality of a man suffering. You're not supposed to think this. You see the dead person on the cross and you think about life everlasting. That is the paradox of Christianity. You don't see what's there. You see what you want to see. What this crucifixus does is it makes you look at the reality. When you look at a suffering person, what do you want to do? That's the point. You want to act. Okay, what these artworks do, and especially this one, is precisely what is essential to Feuchtwanger about works of art. And this is why this aesthetic question is almost inessential. It makes you act. You see someone who's suffering, your instinct is you want to help. You want to do something to take the whip away. You want to punch the person who is making that person suffer. You want to punish the torturer. It is a call to action. This crucifixus was a call to action because of its obscene realism. Call to action was not what the Bavarian government was about. If you have a call to action and you want to do something, you want to change the system. Okay, these works of art are all about wanting to change the status quo. The Heide Act, okay, here you have what everybody knew. Women were sexually exploited. This woman put this right into the picture. This was not something you wanted to talk about. It exposed something that was kept concealed. In the same way that Christianity was its crucifixus, keeps the suffering concealed because you're supposed to think life everlasting. If you see a beautiful woman, you think pleasure. You do not think the suffering that a woman who is sexually exploited is going through. And this one, which is actually the most sophisticated one, Joseph and his brothers, which is described. What's the story with Joseph and his brothers? Actually, it's actually very wicked.
Well, they're selling him.
Yeah, okay. In this case, it is the point. It's at the point where Joseph is already a great king, or actually a great official in Egypt, and the brothers are there, and he has smuggled a silver cup into the sack of Benjamin. And says, "Wait a minute, guys. The brothers are all coming, and they want to sell wheat to make money." And he said, and they concluded the deal, and they're about to go. And he says, "Hey, you guys, I'm missing something." And we'll search their sacks, and they find the silver cup in Benjamin's bag. And Benjamin, of course, who is in fact the exact brother because there are many wives, and so they're not often the same mother, these brothers. But Joseph and Benjamin are from the same mom. Benjamin sits there very relaxed because he's onto what Joseph is doing. But the brothers are completely flabbergasted, and they're painted as peasants who are caught with their pants down, basically, but who at this moment can pretend that they're innocent because they are innocent. Only they're not innocent because way back when Joseph was little, they sold him down to Egypt. So in fact, the only thing that's happening here is that Joseph, who is now on the top, this is all about getting power, who's had success, who is now on the top because he had effort, is getting even with the guys who did him a bad turn. And it is only very gradually that it is dawning on them, although not at the moment yet of this painting, that there's something going on and that justice is being served, is being enacted, right? Which is why this painting is also called Justice. That is the undercurrent of the book, which is about justice. Okay, now this guy Krüger had the temerity of exhibiting in his art gallery in Munich pictures that were an analysis of the status quo. People were cheating each other, didn't want to be caught, but here, art exposes what the undercurrent is. The exploitation of women and the suffering of human beings, all of which were calls to action to change the system. That was not going to be tolerated. And for that, he was going to be framed. So he's put in jail, and they're going to frame him by accusing him of having sworn a Meineid, false oaths. And the trial happens, and most of you who've read the first few chapters will understand that. Okay, now, we need to understand that how society is portrayed first. There are, as we move on, okay, so this, there are, let's do this way. So here, representatives of the law. Now, I'm looking at who are the actors in this novel. There's the law. There's a representative of politics. And they're the representatives of art. And they all grouped around this Krüger. Okay? So, if you have this man Hartl, who is the Vorsitzender of the Gericht, whatever it is, the head of the trial, whatever you call it, he later enters politics. Everyone who is connected here to the law is also connected to politics. So Gaia, for instance, enters politics. So that there is a strong interrelation between law and politics. And there's also a strong interrelation between law and the arts. Now, if you think about it just through personal union, I'll talk more about that too. So there are the people whom we see. Now you can say you have your Krüger triangle here. So you have law, politics, and the arts, and your case in the middle. And we get a huge array of personnel. We have here our jurors, our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, our 7 jurors. And we have the whole court system. We have the political system. Actually, they should be sort of like on top. And we have all the artists. And over that, okay, this is just the middle that we see. Over that, we have the secret regions. The secret regions, Regenten. as there are the industrialists with Reindl, Bichler, der Bauernführer, it is always said that the people who are making the action are not the people who are performing here for you. Those are not the ones who are going to call the shot. And in fact, at the very end of the book, because there is an amnesty for Krüger, Johanna asks, what actually made it possible that after all these permutations, Krüger was released? That it was not what I did, it was not what Tüberlin did, it is not what anybody did. It was because the Dollarscheißer. I didn't say that. Okay, I'm not translating it into English. Herr Potter, not Harry, but Washington, David Washington Potter, whatever he's called, liked the Stierkämpferlied. He was smitten by that. And because he liked that, he wanted to see Tüberlin. And because he saw Tüberlin, he said, and said, well, I want to really pump money into the state of Bavaria for electrification. So Tüberlin asked him, well, you're going to get something back from it? He said, well, what am I supposed to ask for? And he said, well, but I have something that I could ask you. Because Potter decides to put money into the Bavarian government and ask for something back, this guy gets an amnesty. Says, whatever I did through the 780 pages of the book, it made no difference. Because the only thing that makes any difference at all in the world is the mighty dollar. That is the argument of the book. So whatever you do here, okay, we can go home already, because the rest of what I have to say is not relevant. Whatever happens, the secret region is the dollar. And why is that? That goes to what we discussed. Because that buys power. Because everybody is going to bend to the dollar because they want power. Money is power. Never forget that. That is what the book is about. And in fact, inflation, the not having of money, the being poor, is precisely what makes the folks in Bavaria open to Hitler's message. It is the deprivation, it is the poverty of the people, it is the inflation, the not having a job, the worries about where to get your income. It's always compared. The dollar is now 180 marks. A pound of bread costs such and such. A liter of milk costs such and such. It is money that makes you open to manipulation. When you do have money, and now don't forget that Lloyd Feuchtwanger was wealthy, you are much less vulnerable to this kind of pressure. But that's only one argument, okay? Now you would have to say, because we already have this, but wait a minute, there is an element that is maybe independent of money, and it is art. Because through art, if you handle it effectively, if you express it exactly in the way that you ought to express it, not because it will be entertaining, but because you see it that way, and you will show, independent of anybody else, and this is what Krüger is, he did not care what anybody was thinking. He thought these were great pieces and he exhibited them. That is independence. Maybe then you can counteract the power of the dollar. Of course, he paid, and he ultimately was not effective. But it was an attempt. And the courage of this attempt, this is what Feuchtwanger celebrates. Okay, but the structure of the society is that on the one hand, we have the secret regions, whom we don't know. Not to do it, the secret regions don't even want to show their face anymore. Okay, you have what I would simply call the performance artists now, okay, here. And you have the people for whom it is done. And those people here, the jurors, are taken out of the hoi polloi down here. Those are the proletariat and the peasants and all of that, and they don't even count. Now let's look at the performance artists. If you think about the three performers, groups of big performers, what do law, as in the court, politics, and art have in common? People who know Cicero are at an advantage now. Think about Rome. It's very Roman.
He also wrote a historical novel.
Huh?
He also wrote Der jüdische Krieg.
That's right, Josephus, that's right. He
Yes,
actually,
Josephus.
that is so good of you. That's the Josephus trilogy, which
That's
was
actually
set,
the one that
which
I
was
read.
set in the first century. So just as Rome moves from a republic to an empire.
Yes,
Just-
and he's steeped in it. He knows it inside out.
Oh, he knows it inside out. But this is very, very, very Roman. We're talking about it. What is okay? Think about okay. Let me make it as an example. Johanna compares at some point the Revue. Nicht noch höher geht's nimmer. That was Kasperle im Klassenkampf. Okay, first, and then it becomes höher geht's nimmer. The Revue that Flaucher produces, so there's a variety show that is being produced, which is with lots of naked women and sort of for the entertainment. Was supposed to be a political review first, and then all the politics was cut out. So a variety show, as you have it in Las Vegas, okay, one of the variety shows, she compares it to the trial of the person who painted the self-portrait, the female act, okay. What do a review and a trial and show? Let's call it a show trial have in common.
They are productions of shows.
Their productions are they play to the audience. They play to the audience. When you are an advocate, when you are the prosecutor or the defense attorney, you don't think about what is just. You're thinking about how is this going to play with the audience.
And they appeal to emotion.
Your appeal to the emotions does not appeal to reason. It's got to appeal to something in the gut so that you are getting people and they will vote for you. Panem et circenses, okay? The circuses in Rome, the trials that Cicero, we understand rhetoric, and now we go to rhetoric, okay? We understand the science of rhetoric, which we know from Cicero, is designed for persuadere ut, okay? To persuade. Forensic speech has to persuade. Nicht überzeugen, sondern überreden. Not to persuade by argument, but to persuade because your rhetoric is good. So you could argue that a Hitler giving a talk, giving a speech in the Bierhalle, Geyer giving his defense, or somebody performing in a theater, now we have the three art forms, are doing all the same. They cater to the audience. They need to be effective. So theater or rhetorical performance is one form of art that can be persuasive, that can be perfected. So all of these, and Krüger is now caught in a triangle of people who are all out to play to an audience in order to get across their point of view, which will lift them into power. Okay? Have I lost you yet? Okay, not yet. All right. So we understand, and this is for those of you who've read the novel, the people in here, there are a number of characters who are associated with the law and with politics. There are two people, Klenk. They're both ministers. One is the Minister of Culture, this is Flaucher. And one is the Minister of Justice. Later they change places. In fact, Flaucher, this is of course Romana Klee. Flaucher is Gustav Ritter von Kahr, who was the Minister President of Bavaria, and who was the one, when Hitler was doing his famous putsch, first said, yes, I'm all for it, and he got those three guys to go so the way it was, in Flaucher, who was the Minister President, was giving a talk on November 8th, you remember, not personally, but from history, in the Bierhalle. Hitler shows up, boom, shoots into the ceiling, everybody's quiet, he says, I'm not proclaiming the National Revolution, and the Berlin government is no more, and now we are now taking over. And Flaucher was like, okay. And he says to these three guys, okay, that's the military guy and Flaucher and somebody else, I want you, while Goering was giving a speech and entertaining the masses, I want you to go with me into the next room, and I want you to sign this paper, and I want you to sign on. So Flaucher was thinking, what am I going to do? Okay, I'm going to go say yes now. And then he said yes. And then a little while later, as he was being released around 10 o'clock, he changed his mind, and then he called in the troops, and the putsch was over. And so this was this guy who actually, some people said was a turncoat and a betrayer, but actually, this is the argument that Feuchtwanger makes, sacrificed his reputation. You remember that, it's very moving, sacrificed his reputation in order to save Bavaria, because he said that was the only good way of doing it. You go along with it right now, and then as soon as you're being released, you call in the troops, and you say, well, this revolution is not going to stand. So this is one of the people who actually turns out to be sort of like a good guy, though not really. So the political people change places all the time, and they play it just in the opportunistic ways that we described already. They are interconnected with the laws. People in the law are appointed according to which person they serve. So that's very clear. Now what about the arts? So they belong to this. The relationship, I should actually really have done this differently. I should have the politics and the law side by side. They have the closest relations to the secret regions, and they are opposed, and that would probably be the best way to do this, in the way of structure, where so you have politics and you have the law, at the center of which is Krüger, who has to defend himself against them, set over and against the arts. What can the arts do in order to temper or to dampen the disastrous effect that law and politics can have, that they manipulate the masses? What can be done? Is it in fact so that there can be an independent art? Is there such a thing? And if there is an independent art, what kind of art does it have to be? And that is really what the book is about. It is about forms of art. Now, if you think about, having said about the trial being an art form like a theater, and having said that politics is an art form like theater, but through rhetorics, I want to now focus on the arts. Okay? And I want to look at first at this guy, Krüger, who is this major, who is an art historian. And he understands something about the effectiveness of art, but not really. Krüger changes in the time of his internment. He is an aesthete when we meet him. He's very self-satisfied. He enjoys good artworks while they're there. He enjoys the way the structure is. You know, I was somebody today who complained about because the colors wasn't right, and I looked at it aesthetically and I said, you know, I really got to do this, that, the other way. I didn't really think about how something was effective. I was just sort of like looking at the structure of the flyer, and I said, okay, we need to play with the colors, so something like that. Okay? Although an effective aesthetic structure becomes a call to action if it works, if it moves you in a way that you can make the aesthetic structure worm its way into your gut so that you become somebody who acts in the public arena. Now, this Krüger moves from an appreciation of art to something else. And it's expressed metaphorically because first, and this is still in prison, he's looking at a painter called Alfonso Cano, who paints self-portraits when he's sort of in love with himself, to writing a book about Goya. Of course, Feuchtwanger also wrote a book about Goya, who is a painter salaried by the higher powers who comes to recognize the horror of war. Goya is somebody who changes and who asserts his independence by creating work of arts like the dream sequence, like the black paintings, like the horrors of war, or Saturn eating his children, that grip you in the gut and that give you nightmares. Here is someone who moves from sheer representation of power to representation of fear that is so effective that it can grip you after 200 years. And in fact, not just this, Goya in fact became famous for a particular style of portraiture. If you remember, maybe or maybe not, the portrait of, and you can actually just call it up on your iPad, the portrait of the family of Charles IV. They're all standing there, a whole big Spanish family. And somebody commented, it was actually a contemporary, said, "This is King Charles IV of Spain, mighty emperor." He said, he looks just like the baker from next door, married to a wife who's just realized that she's rich. And that, if you look at these faces, they are so beat up, yeah, they're so petit bourgeois, they're so nothing, that you can just smell these people. And the clothes are sitting on them, not as if they were to the man born, but if they're just hanging on to their power. It is the wife who's really ugly, who's sort of moved into the center because it was known that she was running the house, and then, you know, the husband was sort of hindered. He was somebody who showed what power was really like by making realistic portraits. Okay, so this is where Krüger is moving. And this is in prison, and of course he actually dies there of a heart attack. So it's a movement born by insight that you ought not to focus just on what pleases you, but that you ought to focus your art by making it into a mirror of reality, which is of course exactly what that book is doing. Okay. Now, there are many artists associated here. From some of you who have read this book, what kind of artists are there in this book? Anything. And they always move in twos. Okay, so we have our, so let's begin with theater. Okay, we have our Kaspar Bröckel, whose form is Brechtian theater. So he wants to have theater that serves the masses. And there are many discussions in the book about what is the function of art in communism. It's discussed right there. This was one of the points that was foremost on people's mind. What is the function of art in communism? Ought there be a function of art? Well, what is it? What is the point of Brechtian theater?
Serve masses and
oh yeah, you should know.
Serve masses,
yeah,
and shape them. Shape their minds.
Shape them.
Yeah, shape up. Change the system. Enlighten the masses about their social condition and its archetype, call to action. You make theater that is effective. Okay? Political theater moves people to action. Thank you. See you later. Good quiet practice. Okay, what is the opposite of that? Okay, theater that is not illusionist, not the Burgkastentheater, but that moves you to action, archetype. What's the opposite of that? And we have that too. Everything in this book, and I should really make it cleaner. Everything in this book actually moves into, this is another structural device that he has, and that actually has something to do with the way that Feuchtwanger himself functioned. He always needs the opposite of something. So if you have here Brechtian theater, let's put Brecht, and political theater, what's the opposite of that? Yeah, it is the revue, okay, which is there only to make money and only for entertainment. We have, for instance, also the medium of film. There are two examples of medium of film. One of them is Panzerkreuzer Potemkin, which is actually called the Orlov here, which was a movie made in 1926, 25, right? Sergei Eisenstein's movie, 1925. So you could say it's a little bit not chronological here, because it was 1925 and the German version came into Berlin theaters in 1926. But he has, in fact, a first chapter, I think maybe book 4 opens with that, of Sergei Eisenstein. Sergei Eisenstein's movie was made very clearly a propaganda movie, sort of for establishing the brotherhood of the sailors, a propaganda. So we have film. What is the ending of the book? I'm actually going very fast. What is the outcome of the book? I mean, this is your last 40 pages. They must be very clear to you now.
It's a documentary film.
It's a film. It is a film because at the very end, Tüberlin, we haven't talked about Tüberlin yet because we haven't talked about the writer's yet, but we'll talk about, so here's our Bröckel, and his sparring partner, of course, is Feuchtwanger, who appears in this book as Tüberlin. Okay, here is one who wants political action, and this guy wants self-expression. He gets married, this is the art, so this is our Krüger. who is of course married to Johanna, but after he dies, Tüberlin and Johanna, no, they don't get married, but they are sort of like together. The two of them form a couple and a sparring partner. He writes a book, which is called Buch Bayern, über Jahrmarkt der Gerechtigkeit, like Vanity Fair, but the fair of justice, like a Jahrmarkt. It's like, what would you call this in English? When you go to the fair and there's all, you know, like an entertainment, what you call it, like when you go to Disney World, what you call it, an amusement park. An amusement park of justice. Justice is for sale, okay, like Vanity Fair, but in this case it is about justice. So he writes this book, and it's called Jahrmarkt der Gerechtigkeit, which of course represents the book that is ahead of you, but Johanna makes a film. And they had a bet, Tüberlin had a bet with Klenk, because Klenk is very happy that Krüger is dead, and he says it cannot be. He's a Die Totenschweigen, by the way, it's a Schnitzler novella, we actually read it. And he said, no, ich werde die Toten sprechen, den Toten sprechen machen. Ich bringe ihn zum Reden. Wie bringt man den Toten zum Reden? How do you make a dead man talk? His Klenk says it is not possible. And that is the task of art. You make dead people talk. How do you make dead people talk? Now, Tüberlin is a writer and thinks, I can do it by writing a book. But Johanna is a modern woman, and she takes advantage of the medium of film, which is why Feuchtwanger introduced Sergei Eisenstein first. And you say it's a documentary, but it's not a documentary. It is much more effective than a documentary. It is one woman talking. All she does is she stands there. There's always two films when you go to the movie theater, and it's the first film that's being shown. And she is huge on the screen, and she talks. And Feuchtwanger describes the audience. They're first talking to each other, and all of a sudden, at some point, when she describes the injustice against Krüger, they begin to listen, and it is dead silence in there. And the movie becomes effective. It moves people. And the bet was actually 2 buttons. Tüberlin says, I bet my entire income from this book that I'm writing against 2 buttons from your jacket. And the last sentence of the book is that Klenk sent 2 buttons, acknowledging that the movie was effective. And now the dead are talking, or the dead man is talking, meaning that through this art form, you can actually maybe not call to action, but certainly enlighten people, which is the function of art.
What if the powerful and the people with money don't allow that to be shown?
That is good. That's why you have to be wealthy. Okay, and I think that is a very good question. In the revue, okay, this is when Tüberlin had no money, which is why at first he's shown by his brother cheating him out of his income. He's shown poor. He wants to make a revue that is political, and he can't do it because money is preventing it. The man who wants to make money on a review is shoving him to the side, and because he wants the review to be commercial. In order to make a film like that, you have to have an outside donor. Who's funding the movie? The almighty dollar. Okay, that is exactly the right question. Just because Tüberlin, because the guy liked the bullfighting song and was seeking out Tüberlin, and Tüberlin got along with him and asked for all of this, he also put him in touch with Johanna, and the film is funded by the good American. Exactly the right question. You can only do it if you have the funds to make you independent. And those funds are not coming from a German source, they're coming from an American source. There was a very positive attitude that Feuchtwanger had toward America, which was not shared to that degree by Brecht, of course. Now, if you're thinking about the two, and it really always moves in two for him. Böckel and Tüberlin really are the center of tension in this book, and they have 2 different attitudes toward art. One of them is that you need to make art that enlightens the masses and calls them to action. And the other attitude is that you need to make art that expresses yourself. Your independent self, not one that, and this is very hard to ascertain, of course, that is subject to outside influences. Well, how are you going to attain that? You really can't. And he becomes aware of that. And it is at the very end that he thinks, no, and he goes through the same process as Krüger does when he moves from Kano to Goya. He says, no, I need to make art that is socially responsible, that paints a mirror of the way reality really is, so that I can move people to action. So he also, he approaches the attitude that Goethe has, although he doesn't go quite that far. There are various scenes in there that are absolutely extraordinary. There are, apart from the revue, there's the Volkstheater. Do you guys know Karl Valentin? Karl Valentin, he plays a major role there. What is special about Karl Valentin? Karl Valentin, who was also supposed to be part of the revue, was actually dropped out. What's special about Karl Valentin? He plays stupid.
He's
Okay? He plays a stupid Bavarian. And in his stupidity, he shows the stupidity of the Bavarians. He is a major actor here. In fact, he was so popular in presenting a mirror of the Bavarian mentality that the Nazis did not dare touch him. He stayed in Munich all that time. They did not dare touch him because there would have been a riot in Munich. There would have been a riot for Karl Valentin, for nobody else. He entertains, he makes people laugh, and at the same time there is extraordinary political criticism, satire built into his shows. He plays a role. He is another sparring partner for Goethe. There is the Kasperltheater. There is the Auerduld, which is a kind of flea market where people perform and show their wares. There is, in fact, the Passion Play. You probably didn't read as far as the Passion Play. The Passion Play in Oberammergau, which is here called Oberfernau or something like that, is shown, its commercialization. This goes back to your question, what is the influence of money? What is shown here is a commercialization of a religious play into a review, into something that is for pure entertainment. So it is the corruption, in this case, the corruption through money. And the counterpart to the Passion Play, and this is very important in this book, and it is a leitmotif through the book, the bullfight. There is a chapter, in fact it was an independent short story, that is just about the bullfight. Did you remember that? It is Kreiderer, who is the painter of the crucifixus, and who has lost his way. The crucifix was very successful, and he made a lot of money after that. Now he's also surrounded by his little naked ladies, by the Hazel, and he completely declines. And as he's almost out of money, he makes a kind of pilgrimage. And the pilgrimage is to Spain, of course, and Goya's in the background here. And he goes to a bullfight. And he sees that bullfight, and he's very moved by that. And what he's moved by, he sees the matador, and matadores, and they're like, and he sees the bulls, and they're, and it's fantastic, and I'm cheering, and it's fantastic, and it's a performance in which somebody's put to death, which is the parallel of the performance in Oberammergau, where there's somebody put to death, right? Christ is put to death. This bull is put to death. And all of a sudden, after 3 bulls, and they're killed, and they're dying, and it's heroic, and it's war, and it's fantastic, and it's a choreograph, and it's elegant, and it's pleasing, and aesthetic, and all of that, you can make tiles from it, like Hutschenreuter. Actually, Hessreiter is a real person. Hutschenreuter, China, okay, that's the guy. So he is making art now, and the artwork that he produces is a series of bullfighting tiles that you can put on your kitchen wall, which is really glorification of death. But that ultimately is what art is about. You see the art, and you don't see the death behind that. And what Kreiderer sees, and this is the guy who painted the crucifixus, remember? that was the one where the suffering of a human being was shown. He doesn't see the matadores, and he doesn't see the elegance, and he doesn't see the choreography, and he doesn't see that you got to be heroic. He sees this fourth bull that's coming in, and that bull is a coward. You know, he doesn't want to go for it. But he's made to go for it because people want to be entertained, right? I mean, it's reality TV. No, it's not TV. You're right there. It's the gladiators. And he is tortured to death. And at the very end, he goes all the way to the Palisades, and he pees on himself, because that's what people and animals do when they die. And all he wants to do is die. And at that point, Greiderer has an insight. And he's getting back in touch with art, because that's what it is about. That is what his calling is, that you got to show how people die. And interestingly enough, he uses this bullfight, this peeing bull, in a very strange way at the end. And in fact, there is a book, one of the chapters in the book is called Der wasserlassende Stier. And it is about Planck. It's chapter 12 in book 5. Which begins first with Hitler, and then at the end, in fact, this is the trial, another show trial, when after the putsch, Hitler's put on trial, and people, and it's stacked with people sympathetic to him, and the Vorsitzender des Gerichts, whoever's in charge of the court,
Chief Judge?
No? Yeah, Chief Justice, good. Okay. So whoever's in charge of the trial allows him to talk for 4 hours. Okay? That is the first part of this chapter. And then he talks about Flaucher, Gustav Ritter von Kahr, who is called as a witness. And we now see the ascendancy of Hitler with his 4 hours that he was granted by the people in power. And we see Flaucher, and he becomes the peeing bull, the bull who wants to die, because this is the argument that Feuchtwanger makes, that he sacrificed his reputation, his stance in history by basically first going along with Hitler in order to be able to oppose him. And this image that 300 pages earlier we have seen in the bullfight, now Greiderer paints a portrait of the bull, which is really a portrait of Flaucher, which goes to show that what Feuchtwanger does here is, yes, he does write historical novels, but they are about real things. Like you said about the Judith von Toledo, is really a metaphor for Christian-Jewish relations. Like Gaia is really a metaphor for other things that are going on. That you need to disguise what you want to show, and at the same time, you need to make it realistic enough for people to be gripped. People are gripped by a dying animal, but it stands for something else. And in this case, it is the dying regime. There is something good about Flaucher. You know, like you said earlier, Elena, München, you want to vomit, and at the same time you like it, because there is something extraordinary independent about the Bavarians. They don't want to knuckle under the Berliners. They don't want to go with that regime. They want to be their own thing. But what is happening to them is that they are corrupted by the rhetoric, that they want power, and the moment you want power, you become vulnerable to being corrupted. And that's what's being shown. And that is why that Flaucher went that way, that Gustav Ritter von Kahr, and was defeated in that. And that is what Greiderer wants to show in his art. And that, Feuchtwanger says, that is the functional art. To go to the core where it really hurts. Okay, so there are many more artists, but I think I'll have to let
I have one more question. Why did Feuchtwanger fall out of favor? Because it was so popular and now it's so hard.
That is exactly, okay, so now we have this thing. Okay, I'll talk about this tomorrow a little bit. This is called Erfolg, okay? But if you think about Erfolg, yeah? And let's go talk about the concept of Erfolg. When you become popular as an artist, Goethe says that, okay? They have a discussion. He said, in fact, Tuvalin is very successful. In fact, there is a reflection. Tuvalin, of course, is Feuchtwanger. He's one of the characters who actually comes in very late, actually, like page 250 or something. And he goes abroad to America, just like Feuchtwanger did. In fact, his finance for America, but as his book becomes wealthy through it, can finance his many undertakings. And Poiple says to him, and he says to Poiple, I know what you think, that if something is successful, it's going to serve the people in power, because otherwise it couldn't be successful. If something is not successful, then because only things that are confirming the people in power will be allowed to be successful, because that's the way we are controlled. If you want to change things, and that is of course the initial bet with the three pictures, you are not allowed to be successful because the people in power will not want you to change things. Therefore, because you are successful, you must necessarily, as a conclusion, be in favor of the regime. That is what you think, isn't it, Poiple? And he says, well, that's what I think. Okay, now is it so? So that bet is on the table. Now, when we think about, I don't know, Tom Clancy, or what's the other guy who writes the scary stuff?
Stephen King?
Yes, thank you. Okay. Stephen, I've never read one of the novels. Why have I not read one of the novels? Well, first of all, I don't like horror stuff, but let's say, because he's successful, so I'm already suspicious. What appeals to the masses cannot necessarily be good. That was an attitude. Can you confirm this? That there was sort of like an attitude around. I mean, of course, you're a film guy, and this is actually one of the things. I'm from the old school. Okay, film to me was the medium of the masses. I had great difficulty actually understanding that some films, even Disney films, are works of art. I was watching Rango last night, okay, which is a commercial film, not produced by Disney or something else, but you can take Toy Story. It took me 5 times watching Toy Story to understand that this is a work of art. It's fantastic. In a way, it manipulates you. I don't know. So there are, because film was made to appeal to the masses, I was thinking it cannot be any good. And that, in the olden days, was a strike against Feuchtwanger. Because he was so popular, it was considered that he was any good. And it is true, the language isn't as verified as Thomas Mann, da da da. But if you measure it, so there are 2 measurements of art. Is it aesthetically pleasing? But then you have to ask, who was giving you the standards? Who was educating you into the standards to find this or that thing aesthetically pleasing? And the other one is a work of art effective, independent of its aesthetic structure? Those 2 views of art are pitted against each other in that book, and it's actually, I think, not resolved, at least not in the book. It comes down, you could say, because Planck sends the 2 buttons from his jacket down on the side of effectiveness. If a work is effective, it has served its purpose. That is the function of art. Whether or not it is pleasing doesn't really matter. Aesthetically pleasing to an elite. I think that's the way, I would say that's where Feuchtwanger comes out. And that's where he puts his mouth, and that's where he puts his novels. His novels are designed to be effective. And because they were effective, and here the evildoer, and I'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow, is Marcel Reich-Ranitzky, who in 1973 condemned Feuchtwanger basically to death by saying he is, can read this to you, it's actually quite stunning. He said, for 3 words, okay? So in 1973, Reich-Ranitzky said about Feuchtwanger's work, they are schlau und bieder, verschmitzt und Hausbacken. Schlau und bieder, verschmitzt und Hausbacken. Think about those words. What do they mean? That's the way he was. Schlau, that means you associate peasants, you know, sort of like thinking about how to get your advantage. Bieder, that means petit bourgeois. That means uncultivated, unsophisticated, unelegant. Hausbacken, that means concerned about yourself. und verschmitzt. That sort of means like being very sly and trying to see how you're going to get your advantage here. Okay? That is a put down. That is an extraordinary put down, disqualifying Feuchtwanger from any ranking in the high arts. 1973, Marcel Reicharnitzky. And that judgment, I remember it well, because I was in gymnasium at that time and I was reading Feuchtwanger, and it prevented me from reading Feuchtwanger for a very long time. Why? You have to now ask, why did Reicharnitzky say that in 1973? You have to think back, I'm sorry if I'm going to say things that I'm going to say tomorrow, is that okay? It's like, okay. Yeah, because in 1956, and I owe this insight to this great biography by Wilhelm von Sternburg, Feuchtwanger, it's really worth reading. In 1956, when Reicharnitzky was still living in Poland, he was saying about the Judin von Toledo that it is a masterwork of the German language. In 1973, he was knocking Feuchtwanger's language as basically pathetic, as inadequate. Okay. In 1973, Marcel Reicharnitzky lives in Germany, and I think he's working at the Zeit at that point already. You might already have moved to FLZ. What's the difference?
How is it hard?
In Poland and in the Soviet Union, because of this book, we didn't talk about the Moscow book, because it was always thought that Feuchtwanger was not a communist, but he was very strong socialist leanings, and he was definitely a man on the left. Feuchtwanger's books were always in print in the GDR, in Eastern Germany, and they were always in print in the Soviet Union. He was a classic. He was a representative German writer. That could not be. Okay, somebody who it was automatically assumed that in the East, ideology trumps aesthetics. It doesn't matter. If you look at Bergson, or if you look at any of the Yiddish writers, just happen to be familiar with those, people who were aesthetically good, let's say Isaac Babel, he was dead by 1935. He was in the gulags, maybe not quite that year, but he had disappeared. When you look at the Schriftstellerkongress, where he sent a Glückwunsch-telegram in 1934, you could see the crackdown of Stalin on the writers and compelling them to social realism. Social realism, it was thought, was aesthetically unpleasing because it was serving the masses, and it was simplifying structures in order to make political action happening. It was serving the regime. Therefore, it could not be aesthetically pleasing. If a writer who was serving this audience and was published there and was pushed by the powers that be, was successful, therefore, he could not be good by definition. It was not a judgment that was thought through. And that judgment was in effect, I would say, through the 1980s. And it is really only after the fall of the wall, in the 1990s, that we get a reconsideration of Feuchtwanger, beginning with the Sternburg biography as a first-rate writer. Sophisticated, exact, the language alive, gripping you, complex, nuanced, really one of the great writers I would say, of the 1930s and 1940s. But that was not open on account of his success in the 1930s, and then after the war, his success in the eastern part of Europe. That success was not looked at neutrally. So you could say that political reasons, political blindness, prevented a recognition of Feuchtwanger's true stature as a writer. So
but you don't have to agree with that he's that good.
Oh, I think he's that good. I think he is that good.
He's fun. He's a lot of fun to read.
He is a lot of fun, and if you, I'm sorry you didn't read this book, because I feel like I did a very bad job showing the structure, but that is because,
well, it
doesn't
help if you haven't read the book.
That's
all
right.
The structure doesn't help.
That's right. That's why I cannot really say, but I just told you so. Okay.
Yeah.
But I wished, if you had read it, and I'm not sure if you look at this book, it is astounding the variety of art forms that he shows, the entire book becomes a tema con variazione on the act of performance. And performance is measured by the effectiveness of the performer and by the way you can affect a performer and what are the structures that you're using. And he shows you can make really a circle, how one saying shades off into another saying, and he captures the entire city of Munich as one great theater, Jahrmarkt, of performance. That is a feat that is very hard to accomplish. And if you look at, you read a section of Feuchtwanger, and then you read a section on Thomas Mann, please. I mean, the stiffness of Thomas Mann, the anal retentiveness, the rigorousness, the rigidity of the thought, the suppressed emotions. Oh, it makes you wonder why this guy, of all, was really the king of German literature, when we do have Feuchtwanger, because so alive. Huh?
Because of language. If you know,
that you are aesthetically conditioned.
He's much. That's right. I think. That's right. But if you know how to really well construct a novel, which every
writer student knows how to do, right?
Well, yes. That's how a first-class writer. I would say no.
But the language is funny, and it's witty, and it is effective. And if you measure the value of art by its effectiveness, you know, maybe
because then every how do you call these?
Every Russian theater piece would be effective, right?
Cartoon.
No, not cartoon. When you're very successful, all the bestsellers. All the bestsellers, they know how to construct a.
Okay, so now we see what it is. Okay,
but it's not first-class writing.
Okay, so
all the time.
Good. So let's make this. Let's allow 2 more minutes to make this more complicated, because I was arguing Advocatus Diaboli. Okay, because ultimately the only thing that matters is aesthetic quality. Okay, so I'm now reversing myself, because the danger of opting for the effectiveness of art is that you can be manipulated. Okay? An effective piece like Sergei Eisenstein's film, like Hannah's film, appeals and is exactly what you said, not to reason, but to the emotions. And that is scary as all get out. And it is shown with the Kutzner or Hitler's rhetoric. If you feel disadvantaged, you can find in this work of art, the Hitler talks, or the theater, Brecht theaters and Hitler's talk, are not that different, but I can't say this out loud. Okay? So, because they appeal to the masses and they manipulate the masses. And now you are totally right about this. Aesthetic structures are totally independent of that. But for those, you have to be educated. And I'll give you an example of that, okay? Think about Primo Levi and his being in the camps. And what was it that gave him the greatest comfort? Not the effectiveness of art, the structure of Dante's Divina Commedia that he had learned by heart, and that he was reviewing for himself. Another example, a poet you don't know, but I know well, Abraham Sutzkever, one of the last Yiddish poets. He was caught in Vilna when the Germans came in 1941, and he had spent 7 weeks lying under a roof. And what did he do to stay alive? He tried to make the perfect poem. A poem, and why did he want to make a poem? When I first heard it, I was attacking my Yiddish teacher. How can you be in Vilna and you got to go fight against the Germans and you got to go do something? How can you waste your time making a poem? It makes absolutely no sense. And she said, you cannot kill a poem because the poem is going to survive. The poem, in its aesthetic quality, and here's where you're exactly right, is independent of the judgment of time. If a poem is really good in its aesthetic structure, like Death in Venice, I would grant you that. Not Salvador, but Death in Venice is a perfect work of art. Then it is independent of time, and it doesn't cater to the masses. It caters to the one who wants to get educated to understand the structures. So ultimately, yes, you are right. And Feuchtwanger was wrong. But in his time, he said, when there is need, we need to have the other form of art.
It's not just the aesthetic structure. It's not just aesthetics. All the examples that you're giving, including Sitzkever, there is a geistlich element, which is also outside
Right,
of time.
of course.
And then, Gottfried Benn, for example, argued that was had a great deal to do with his creative.
Gottfried Benn is a great example.
Yes.
Before you go,
Yes.
okay?
He is
If you have someone who goes into innere emigration,
Yes.
okay, which is precisely said, how is it possible for Gottfried Benn to stay in Germany during the Nazi period? You can, and I thought there's no such thing. I always say, no such thing as innere emigration. But if you write the perfect poem, that shows your independence. Now, counterexample, okay, T.S. Eliot, Gerontion. Is that a great poem? This kind of anti-Semitism? How do you deal with that? Okay, so you see this conflict between a work of art that is perfect in its aesthetic structure, that can be written by a very nasty guy, or Celine, Journey Through the Night, okay? Or a work of art that is designed for its effectiveness, where you can manipulate all the innocent people who are standing there. It's not resolved. The conflict between Feuchtwanger and Brecht and Thomas Mann, they're really a triangle. It is not resolved, and we need them all. On that note, with Klaus Mann.